Thank you a lot for the introduction, Kerry. And I wasn't really planning on giving a little piano concerto yesterday, but I'm happy that I could make some people happy, for those who stayed until late last night. So I'm going to skip the introductions a little bit because I was already introduced myself yesterday. But you can basically consider that I work on pretty much everything EU related when it comes to industrial carbon management. And this was initially the first topic that Kerry asked me to address for this conference, as this came up in one of our relatively recent report back in January on public procurement and the need for a cluster-based or coordination-based approach in public procurement. So again, this is ZEP/Carbon Management Europe as of 2 weeks ago. If you don't know us, again, we work closely with the institutions, with the governments, but also with pretty much everyone in this community. And I could not encourage you more to also join us. We do cooperate and collaborate with CO2GeoNet, but if you are geological surveys, academics, projects, and more, do come and join our network. We do very interesting things in different bubbles and circles. All right, so the topic today, public procurement, and we need to start with the beginning, the analysis, which is the infamous coordination challenge that we have in this field, in CCS. I'm not teaching you anything here, but we are talking about aligning a lot of different things together, making sure that we can have timely and coordinated deployment of all these different segments in the value chain. Realistically, we don't expect any single actor to control all these elements, except for very, very few exceptions, which means that we always face a coordination problem between these different segments, as well as what is now commonly referred to as cross-chain risks, both for the CapEx and the OpEx. This affects the bankability of the projects. It also affects the investment certainty and confidence, more generally speaking, to invest in such projects. The question, therefore, becomes how do we approach this from the point of view of public procurement? And traditionally, most public procurement instruments, whether at national level or EU level, are done at a project level, and by project I mean single project level, which is not necessarily the most ideal scenario for a CCS context. The reason, so again, and here I'm talking about the fact that those projects are competing against each other individually, the bids are done individually, the subsidies are allocated individually, and the risks are also borne individually. That works well for sectors that are operationally independent, but that's not true for this field once again. And not only that, but actually, even if you are successful in these public procurement avenues, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're necessarily going to be successful with the rest of the deployment of the value chain. And I think that's quite important to stress. Case study here on the EU Innovation Fund, which has been mentioned quite a few times. Another example of a project-centric approach, so not unlike what we see at other levels. It has been incredible in getting first-of-a-kind projects off the ground, yes, but it does still apply the same approach. So we have single projects that are applying and getting the funding, which is great, but also not great, because essentially those same projects lack sometimes the capability of ensuring the rest of the value chain. And in turn, what we see is that the ones who did reach FID and who did form part of a fully developed value chain were also the ones who got support from other sources, including national public funding schemes, and it leads to fragmentation, which is, again, not necessarily ideal. So, I've talked about why it's not necessarily ideal, but let's even talk about why it could be bad. And this is where this single project-centric approach can even lead to what I would describe as distortive effects in the value chain, where you essentially might end up funding the wrong projects, if there's such a thing. And in that circumstance, or in that context, it's a failure of public funding, really. So there's a mismatch. There's a mismatch, and that's to do with the fact that the procurement system is designed to optimize competition between projects, whereas in this context, in our world, we are talking about something that requires coordination between those projects, not necessarily competition between each other. So a classic scenario, I'm not going to go through the little details, and you can thank my colleague Evard for putting together those little silly icons. But this is more or less what we can see in a sort of worst case scenario, where you have one single emitter getting funding, for example, from the Innovation Fund, which is not enough to sort of aggregate the CO2 volumes required to get the rest of the value chain developed and confidence in investing in that single value chain. You might even get also isolated emitters that are completely disconnected from any form of realistic transport and storage value chain in the area. The alternative then seems to be, or seems to point that way, to go for a much more cluster-oriented approach and making sure that we are targeting and prioritizing those that are located nearby with each other and that do provide the significant critical mass to get the rest of the value chain operational and able to reach FID. And here, before I go further in this notion of what I mean by cluster-based approach, it's also good to give a bit of credit to all those that preceded me in ZEP and Carbon Management Europe now. I'm getting used to it as well. Because, and I will use ZEP because essentially this happened before the transition. ZEP played an essential role in this field to also introduce the concept of clusters. And this goes to some of you in this room who were involved with ZEP at the time. And ZEP did so in different ways and different waves as well, introducing the infrastructure challenge that we had in Europe, but also why this notion of clusters and hubs became so vital to the future of CCS in Europe. And it's 20 years of documentation going in that direction, which I've had the pleasure to go through. And those are some of the key reports that you might still see today. The first one really is incredibly important. It was a report on costs that is still mentioned today in many academic papers. And it goes to show the kind of work that people involved in ZEP put together, and again, I had nothing to do with it, so it's credits to those people. But we've been, as you see, in the past 2 years also doing a lot of work that now sort of add on to this work and push for even more in the current context. And it's interesting to retrace this because the mentality or the philosophy behind what we mean by clusters has also changed a little bit. Initially, it was much more about the infrastructure challenge, the transport and storage infrastructure gaps in Europe. It was then presented, the clusters were then presented in a different way, more as a strategic scaling mechanism. So it was no longer about the infrastructure, it was more so about the opportunity, about what clusters could actually unlock for the rest of Europe. Later on, it even became about strategy, about clusters being the perfect epitome and solution for achieving both decarbonization and competitiveness objectives. And finally, in more recent years, we are really trying to fix everything that's still missing. And that's to do with cross-chain risks, which is certainly at the center of our work today, as well as system bankability, or even showing the sort of uneven infrastructure developments across Europe, as we are trying to provide these opportunities to all Europeans. And now, a few words about what I mean by cluster. We need to be always very specific and careful with words, especially in the EU bubble. And the very term or word of cluster is actually used already in EU policy for completely different reasons. And that's why I do make a point of saying this. We understand cluster in the EU policy jargon as something that's very much about research institutions, SMEs, or innovation ecosystems. Of course, here in our context, we are talking about something that's a bit more about infrastructure, a bit more about these emitters being concentrated geographically somewhere, about sharing the same infrastructure. So it does create a bit of ambiguity, and that's why some are now trying to move away from the notion of clusters, either by being quite cautious or by being sort of preferring other terms. Having said that, cluster remains part of the general discourse because it's just easy to use and people usually understand what we mean by that. But so good to stress that. I've said what we could do and should do potentially at the EU level, but actually we can be a little positive, and you might be surprised that I am positive sometimes, about what's already been done across Europe. And there are some good movements in that direction. So in the UK, and the UK was part of the EU until not so long ago, so I should stress that, and we're very much under the scope of all those ZEP reports that you saw before. The UK has moved into a very cluster-led approach. The Track 1 and Track 2 processes illustrate that perfectly, and they explicitly go for a regional prioritization approach. In Denmark and in the Netherlands, not so much, although it might be sometimes built into the tenders or the SDE++ program. There's a sort of acknowledgement of these realities without really opening that door fully just yet. In France, however, and this is, I think, one of the most exciting and interesting developments recently in public procurement, this Grand Projet Industriel de Décarbonation program introduced the notion of consortium. So it wasn't quite cluster, but it was close enough to get me interested. So I had many calls with the ministry about it to try and understand exactly what they meant and whether we could finally approach this. But it was really interesting, but they essentially allowed applicants to bid together. So as what you could consider to be a cluster, and they had different windows, application procedures, etc. for that type of procedure. So, you've heard me now talk about clusters and coordinated approach, and it sounds like it's a fabulous idea, and therefore you should be asking why we haven't done it. And that's also because it's not a perfect solution in itself. It certainly promotes a lot of good things. The first thing we need to consider are the legal challenges, potential legal challenges to do with competition law, to do with state aid considerations, as well as governance questions. And these are key, and we need to address them quite carefully before building that into public procurement rules. I'm moving slightly forward because I know I'm very close to the end of time, as usual. There's still open questions about what constitutes a cluster, and that's something that still needs to tackle. So part of the questions I had with the French ministry at the time was, did you put a geographical limit, a radius to your consortia? Was it 20, 30, 50 kilometers square? They told me, no, that's why we went for consortia and not cluster, because we didn't think a geographical limit would be a good idea. I was like, that's probably a smart move. But those are the sort of questions we need to be asking ourselves. And then beyond that, as I said, it's not necessarily always perfect. There's also risks to going for a cluster, or risk or inconvenience. That's not to say that that's not necessarily blessing in disguise. We might have to make a tough decision at some point to prioritize those clusters, which will mean that there will be winners and losers, and meaning that we could even have clusters competing against each other. But if that unlocks CCS deployment in Europe, that might be something that we need to consider at some point. So we'll reach my final slide. I did this time finish my presentation. And to say that cluster bids are a very likely evolution of the procurement logic in Europe at EU level, at national level. We see, as I said before, that European policies are already moving in that direction. And it does provide a lot of good answers for the kind of coordination challenges that we find in this field. There's a few safeguards that we still need to put in place. And it does, however, not eliminate all the kind of risks that we identified at the very beginning. So typically on cross-chain risks, we are also working in parallel on other things such as guarantee mechanisms and more infrastructure coordination, the TPA access and the likes, to make sure that everything can move together. I hope I made this interesting. I will have a final... also, I should probably say, we are writing that report. So again, the report will come out. Appreciate if you don't steal everything too quickly. We will get the report out in a nicely manner. And on a completely unrelated note and personal note, just to change the topic a little bit, I learned from my dad just before coming to this event that he came to the San Salvador Island nearly 30 years ago, of all people. For a completely different reason. He came to do some sort of fresco painting course. He was a young architect at the time, trying to learn how to do, if I understand correctly, the marmorino technique, and the Italians can correct me, which is the type of fresco that you find on the facades of Venice, because this island used to be an EU center for training in building trade. So it was quite funny for me to come nearly 30 years later on this very same island, which has completely changed according to what my dad said at the time. And I also stayed in exactly the same youth hostel than he did in Judica by accident. So clearly something is happening. But I'm very happy to be here, and thank you very much for your attention.